the 17th of January 1942, Detroit, Michigan, 6:47 a.m. The morning air hung thick with ice fog over the River Rouge complex, Ford's sprawling cathedral of steel and smoke. Inside Building B, the massive forge hammers had fallen silent, not from mechanical failure, not from lack of raw material, but from the absence of hands. 2,300 production stations stood vacant along Assembly Line 4, their leather gloves draped over idle controls like the shed skin of some industrial animal that had simply walked away. The night shift supervisor, a man named Robert Hendricks, who had spent 31 years watching rivers of men flow through these gates, stood alone on the catwalk above the silent line. His clipboard bore a single notation in red pencil: insufficient male labor. Production target unmet. Across the vast American industrial landscape that morning, a similar paralysis had taken hold. In the Newport News shipyards, half-welded destroyer hulls sat cooling in their berths. At Boeing's Seattle plant, B-17 fuselage sections accumulated in staging areas, waiting for riveters who would never arrive. The great arsenal of democracy, barely 6 weeks into the war that would consume the world, had discovered a mathematical impossibility embedded in its own rhetoric. The calculations were brutally simple. To defeat the Axis powers, American industry would need to produce 60,000 aircraft annually, 45,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. The manpower required exceeded the available pool of draft-exempt men by approximately 2.4 million workers. And the U.S. War Department, in a planning document dated the 28th of December 1941, had concluded with bureaucratic certainty that this gap could not be closed. American women, the report stated, possessed neither the physical capacity nor the temperamental disposition for heavy industrial work. The document cited a century of medical literature, psychological studies, and prevailing social doctrine. It was filed with confidence. It was also catastrophically wrong. What those planners could not envision, what no military theorist or social scientist had predicted, was that within 18 months, the entire structural foundation of American labor would invert. The transformation would not come from government mandate alone, though the mandates would follow. It would not emerge from corporate enlightenment, though corporate necessity would drive it. The change would originate in a more fundamental place, in the quiet decision of millions of women who looked at those empty production lines and made a calculation of their own. They calculated that their hands could learn what men's hands knew. They calculated that their country required their labor more than it required their adherence to social convention. And they calculated, though few would articulate it this way in 1942, that the door forced open by wartime necessity might never fully close again. The woman who would become the face of this transformation did not yet exist. Not as a person, though thousands of actual women were already walking through factory gates that January morning, but as a symbol. Her name would be Rosie. Her image would be born from the collaboration between a wartime propaganda apparatus desperate to fill those production lines and a cultural moment that demanded new definitions of feminine capability. But before Rosie appeared on her first poster, before Norman Rockwell rendered her with oil paints and flexed bicep, the actual women who inspired her were already transforming American industry in ways that would have seemed like science fiction 6 months earlier. The German High Command, monitoring American industrial mobilization with obsessive detail through intelligence networks in neutral countries, initially dismissed reports of female factory workers as propaganda exaggeration. German military doctrine, rooted in 19th-century conceptions of biological determinism, held that women were constitutionally unsuited for precision manufacturing. A Wehrmacht strategic assessment from February 1942, intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, described American claims of female industrial mobilization as transparent psychological operations designed to mask their critical labor shortage. The report concluded that the United States would require at least 2 years to reach meaningful war production levels. This assessment would prove to be one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the European theater. What the Germans could not grasp, what their own ideological framework made invisible to them, was that American women were not merely replacing male workers. They were often exceeding them. At the Willow Run bomber plant outside Detroit, where Ford had constructed the world's largest factory building to mass-produce B-24 Liberators, the female assembly teams consistently outperformed their male predecessors in quality control metrics. By September 1943, the defect rate on female-installed wing assemblies was running 12% lower than the previous year's male-installed units. The reasons were multiple and complex. Women's generally smaller hands proved advantageous in tight spaces within the aircraft fuselage. Their socialized attention to detail, a byproduct of domestic training that emphasized precision in sewing, cooking, and household management, translated directly into better rivet placement and wiring quality. But beyond these practical advantages lay something less tangible and more profound. Motivation born from proof of concept. Every perfectly installed hydraulic line, every flawless weld, became evidence in an argument these women were making with their labor. The argument was not primarily with men, though gender dynamics were certainly at play. The argument was with history itself, with generations of accumulated assumption about the natural limits of female capability. Consider the case of Naomi Parker Fraley, a young woman working at the Naval Air Station Alameda in California. In March 1942, she was photographed operating a lathe in the machine shop, her hair bound in a red polka dot bandana, her face set in concentration as metal shavings spiraled from the cutting tool. The photograph, taken by a Navy photographer documenting the new female workforce, would later be misidentified and transformed into the basis for the iconic Rosie the Riveter imagery. But in that moment, Fraley was simply doing her job, precision-turning crankshaft components for Navy torpedo bombers. She had received 6 weeks of training. The male machinist she replaced had trained for 8 months. Her work, measured by micrometer and subjected to rigorous inspection, was indistinguishable in quality. This was not exceptional. This was typical. At the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Long Beach, California, women composed 47% of the workforce by mid-1943. They worked as sheet metal specialists, hydraulic system installers, electrical assembly technicians, and paint shop operators. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They worked through pregnancies, concealing their condition until it became physically impossible, because pregnancy remained grounds for dismissal at most plants until late in the war. They worked despite the absence of workplace childcare, organizing informal networks of rotating caregivers within their neighborhoods. They worked for wages that averaged 60% of male pay for identical labor, a gap that was simultaneously unjust and revolutionary. Unjust because the discrimination was obvious, revolutionary because it represented the first time in American history that women's industrial labor was being compensated at anything approaching male rates. The recruiting campaigns that emerged to draw women into these factories reveal the deep cultural anxiety surrounding this transformation. The War Manpower Commission, established in April 1942 to coordinate labor mobilization, initially framed its appeals to women in terms of temporary patriotic duty. Early posters featured feminine women in modest dress, with slogans like, "I'm proud my husband is a soldier," and "I'm keeping his job for him." The imagery was carefully constructed to suggest that factory work was a brief interruption of normal domestic life, a sacrifice made for duration of the emergency. But as the war extended and the labor shortage intensified, the messaging shifted. The woman in the posters became more physically capable, more autonomous, more openly powerful. Rosie the Riveter, in her most famous incarnation, the Westinghouse "We Can Do It" poster from 1943, does not defer to absent male authority. She looks directly at the viewer, her expression confident, her raised arm demonstrating strength rather than merely borrowed capability. The transformation in the imagery reflected a transformation in reality. Women were not keeping jobs warm for men, they were creating new definitions of what women's work could encompass. The Japanese military, like their German allies, systematically underestimated American female industrial participation. Japanese strategic planning in 1942 operated from the assumption that American society, with its emphasis on female domesticity and consumer comfort, would prove incapable of the sustained sacrifice required for total war mobilization. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied at Harvard and understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese planners. But even he did not anticipate the speed with which American women would be integrated into war production. Japanese intelligence estimates from mid-1943, captured after the war, calculated that American factories employed approximately 400,000 women in war-related manufacturing. The actual figure was nearly 6 million. This ninefold intelligence error had direct operational consequences. Japanese production targets for aircraft and naval vessels were predicated on the assumption that American output would remain constrained by labor shortages. When American production instead accelerated beyond all projections, achieving in 1944 alone the manufacture of 96,000 aircraft, the mathematical basis for Japanese strategic planning collapsed. They had prepared to fight an industrial power. They found themselves fighting an industrial colossus. The physical toll on these women has been inadequately recorded in popular histories of the war. Factory work in the 1,940 seconds, even before wartime acceleration of production schedules, was brutally demanding. The machines did not accommodate smaller frames or lesser upper body strength. Women working hydraulic presses in munitions plants regularly handled components weighing 30 to 40 pounds, lifting and positioning them hundreds of times per shift. Spot welding required sustained grip strength that left hands cramped and aching. The noise levels in aircraft assembly plants with rivet guns operating continuously across multiple assembly lines caused permanent hearing damage in thousands of workers who lacked adequate protection. The toxic exposure was worse. Women working in munitions factories handling explosive compounds developed symptoms of chemical poisoning, yellowed skin, chronic nausea, reproductive complications. Those painting aircraft with primers containing lead and chromium compounds breathed toxic fumes for hours daily. Occupational safety standards, minimal even for male workers in this era, were often simply not applied to the new female workforce. The assumption seemed to be that temporary wartime employment did not require the same protections as permanent careers, yet they persisted. The reasons were economic, patriotic, and personal, in ways that varied for each individual but accumulated into collective transformation. For some, the motivation was immediate financial need, with husbands, fathers, and brothers in military service. Factory wages became essential family income. For others, the motivation was patriotic in the most direct sense, building the weapons that would protect their loved ones overseas. But many women also discovered something unexpected in the factory environment: competence, camaraderie, and a form of economic independence previously unavailable to them. A welder named Sybil Lewis, working at Lockheed's Burbank plant, recalled decades later, "I had always been told that women's brains were not suited to technical work. Then I learned to read engineering blueprints, to calculate metal stress tolerances, to operate equipment that I'd been assured was too complex for female comprehension. It made me angry not at the men, but at the lie, at all the capacity that had been wasted because we'd believed the lie." The social disruption extended beyond the factory floor. Women earning significant wages exercised new economic power. They opened bank accounts in their own names, made purchasing decisions without male approval, and began to occupy public spaces, restaurants, bars, entertainment venues that had previously been de facto male territory. The phenomenon of groups of female factory workers going out together after evening shifts, still in their work clothes, spending their own money, created visible evidence of changing social patterns. Conservative social critics warned of moral degradation. Religious leaders preached about the importance of maintaining traditional family structures. Women's magazines attempted to bridge the contradiction, with articles explaining how to maintain feminine appearance despite factory work, how to prepare quick meals after long shifts, how to be both Rosie the Riveter and dutiful wife. The cognitive dissonance was palpable in the culture. In Europe, German women were also being mobilized for war production, but under radically different ideological frameworks and with drastically different results. Nazi ideology had enthroned motherhood as women's supreme function, and the regime resisted large-scale female industrial mobilization until catastrophically late in the war. When German women were finally drafted for war work in significant numbers in 1943, they entered a system already collapsing under Allied bombing and resource depletion. More fundamentally, they entered a system that viewed their labor as a temporary deviation from natural order, something to be endured and reversed, not a permanent expansion of women's social role. German female factory workers were not celebrated in propaganda posters as symbols of national strength. They were portrayed, when portrayed at all, as making necessary sacrifices in service to men's war. The contrast in ideological framing mattered. It affected recruitment, training quality, production efficiency, and post-war social trajectory. By 1944, American war production had achieved levels that Allied planners in 1942 had deemed mathematically impossible. The United States produced more military equipment in 1944 than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. This was not primarily the result of superior technology or natural resources, though both played roles. It was the result of labor specifically, the result of integrating millions of women into industrial production with a speed and effectiveness that had no historical precedent. Rosie the Riveter, the symbolic figure, had become real in millions of individual expressions. She worked the night shift at Pratt & Whitney, machining engine components. She welded destroyer hulls at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. She assembled radio equipment at RCA Victor plants in New Jersey. She loaded artillery shells at ammunition depots across the Midwest. She was black and white and Latina and Asian American. She was single and married and widowed. She was 23 and 56. She was not one woman. She was a demographic revolution disguised as wartime necessity. The psychological impact on the women themselves proved more durable than anyone anticipated. In surveys conducted immediately after the war, approximately 75% of women working in war industries expressed the desire to remain in the workforce. They did not all want to remain in factory work. Specifically, many described the work as exhausting and would have preferred other employment, but they wanted to continue as wage earners, as economically independent actors. This desire collided with post-war social policy designed to reabsorb returning male veterans into the economy. Women were laid off en masse as war production contracts were cancelled. They were excluded from GI Bill benefits that provided education and housing assistance to veterans. They faced renewed employment discrimination as corporations reconstituted pre-war hiring policies that restricted women to clerical and service positions. The cultural messaging shifted abruptly, with media and advertising campaigns promoting suburban domesticity as women's proper sphere. Rosie the Riveter disappeared from posters, replaced by images of apron-clad housewives admiring kitchen appliances. But the door, once forced open, would not fully close. The women who had worked in wartime factories did not forget their competence. Their daughters, growing up hearing stories of their mother's war work, absorbed a different understanding of female capability than previous generations. When the women's movement emerged in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, it built on foundations laid in the 1,940 seconds. The legal battles for workplace equality, for access to non-traditional occupations, for equal pay, these campaigns drew historical legitimacy from the precedent of women's wartime industrial service. Rosie became a feminist icon not in 1943, when she first appeared, but in 1982, when the image was rediscovered and repurposed by activists seeking historical symbols of female strength. The German soldiers who eventually encountered the material output of American female labor did so under conditions of profound cognitive dissonance. In the hedgerows of Normandy, in the forests of the Ardennes, they faced an American military equipped with overwhelming material superiority. Every Sherman tank that rolled toward their positions, every artillery shell that screamed overhead, Every B-17 bomber that appeared in formation above them represented the product of an industrial system they had been assured could not function. Nazi propaganda had told them that American society was weak, feminized, incapable of the masculine virtues required for total war. They had been promised that American industrial production, dependent on inferior labor and racial mixing, would produce inferior equipment in insufficient quantities. Instead, they faced an avalanche of materiel that buried the Wehrmacht under its sheer mass. The shells that killed them had been manufactured by women in Pennsylvania. The aircraft that strafed their columns had been assembled by women in California. The trucks and jeeps and supply ships that sustained the American advance all bore the invisible signature of female labor. Some German prisoners of war, held in camps within the United States, were assigned to work details that brought them into proximity with American factories. Their observations, recorded in camp reports and post-war interviews, reveal profound shock at the scale and effectiveness of American industrial production and particular disbelief at the visible presence of women in heavy manufacturing roles. One former Wehrmacht officer, interviewed in 1947, described watching women operate overhead cranes at a steel mill near his POW camp. This would have been unthinkable in Germany. Not merely socially unacceptable, but literally unthinkable. We had constructed an entire ideology around the natural capabilities of men and women. To see it so thoroughly contradicted by reality was disturbing. It raised questions about what else we had been told that might be equally false. The symbolism of the riveting gun, Rosie's iconic tool, carried meanings that extended far beyond its functional purpose. The pneumatic riveting gun, introduced in aircraft manufacturing in the 1932, was a violent implement. It fired metal rivets at tremendous force, the repeated concussive impacts creating a distinctive staccato that defined the soundscape of aircraft plants. To operate, one required upper body strength, hand-eye coordination, physical endurance, and tolerance for sustained noise and vibration. It was precisely the sort of tool that pre-war engineering texts had identified as unsuitable for female operators. When women not only operated riveting guns competently, but achieved quality metrics equal or superior to male riveters, the tool itself became symbolic evidence of collapsed assumptions. The rivet gun in Rosie's hand was not merely a tool. It was a question mark attached to every limiting belief about gender and capability. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese soldiers fighting in the Philippines, Okinawa, and the home islands encountered American forces, supported by supply chains of staggering efficiency. The logistical superiority of American forces, the ability to maintain forward units with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment rested on the industrial base that female labor had made possible. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual strength and warrior virtues as counterweights to material inferiority. The Bushido Code told Japanese soldiers that their superior morale and willingness to die would offset American industrial advantages. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, they demonstrated horrifying levels of suicidal bravery throughout the war, but because industrial capacity, once sufficiently mobilized, overwhelms individual valor through sheer accumulation. The American soldier on Saipan carried equipment manufactured by workers the Japanese High Command had not believed existed in sufficient numbers. The disconnect between Japanese intelligence assessments and battlefield reality created strategic paralysis. The epilogue of Rosie the Riveter's story is still being written. In the immediate post-war years, her disappearance from public consciousness seemed complete. The women who had embodied her returned to domestic life or struggled in lower-wage female-designated jobs, their wartime contributions quickly fading from national memory. The factories that had employed them converted to peacetime production and implemented hiring practices that excluded women from production work. For 2 decades, it seemed the wartime mobilization of female labor would be recorded as a temporary aberration, a brief suspension of normal social order forced by crisis and reversed as soon as crisis passed. But history does not move only in the directions that power intends. The women who had worked in war plants told stories to their daughters and granddaughters. Those stories contained implicit arguments about capability and limitation, about what women could accomplish when given the tools and opportunity. When those daughters and granddaughters demanded access to education, to professions, to economic independence in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, they carried with them the accumulated evidence of their mother's generation. The legal victories came slowly: the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibiting sex discrimination in employment, Title IX in 1972 opening educational opportunities. Each legislative advance rested on the historical foundation that Rosie and her real-life counterparts had constructed. They had proven, under conditions of urgent necessity, that women could perform industrial labor at the highest levels. This proof could not be unmade. It could be ignored, suppressed, forgotten for a time, but it could not be erased from history. In the 21st century, Rosie's image has been reproduced so often that it risks becoming empty iconography, a generic symbol of female empowerment divorced from its specific historical context. She appears on coffee mugs and T-shirts, often with no accompanying explanation of what she represented or when she existed. This commodification threatens to obscure the actual historical experience, the exhaustion, the discrimination, the physical toll, the economic injustice of unequal pay, the forced layoffs when the war ended. The real women who inspired Rosie deserve better than corporate branding. They deserve recognition that includes both celebration of their accomplishments and acknowledgement of the costs they bore and the injustices they endured. The foundational truth remains. American industrial mobilization during World War II succeeded because millions of women decided to walk through factory gates and prove that gender-based assumptions about capability were fictions. They did not do this primarily to advance women's rights, though that became an eventual consequence. They did it because their country required their labor, because their families needed their wages, because the alternative was national defeat. But in doing it, they changed permanently what American society understood to be possible. The weapons they built defeated fascism in Europe and the Pacific. The precedent they set weakened, though did not destroy, the structures of gender discrimination at home. That morning in January 1942, when Supervisor Robert Hendricks stood on the catwalk looking down at the silent assembly line, he could not have imagined what was coming. Within 6 months, that line would be running at unprecedented efficiency, staffed by women who had never seen the inside of a factory before December. Within 2 years, American war production would exceed the combined output of all enemy nations. Within 3 years, the weapons manufactured on that line would be rolling through the streets of Berlin in American columns. And within 7 decades, the image of a woman in a factory, flexing her arm and declaring, "We can do it," would become one of the most recognized symbols in American history, recognized, though not always fully understood. The rivet guns have long since fallen silent. The factories that produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 have been demolished or converted to other purposes. The women who worked in them are dying now, the last members of that generation passing beyond the reach of historical interview. But what they proved remains proven. They demonstrated that capability is not primarily a function of biology, but of opportunity, training, and necessity. They demonstrated that social assumptions about natural limitations often reflect nothing more than the accumulated prejudices of prior generations. They demonstrated that democracy, when sufficiently threatened, can mobilize resources and populations with a flexibility that totalitarian systems, locked in rigid ideologies, cannot match. This was Rosie's victory. Not merely that she helped build the weapons that won the war, though she did. Not merely that she proved women capable of industrial labor, though she did. Her deepest victory was this: she made it impossible to claim again, with any historical credibility, that women's participation in the full economic and social life of the nation was biologically impossible. The lie had been tested under maximum pressure and failed. The door she forced open has never fully closed. It cannot. The historical record will not permit it. And so the image endures a woman in denim, her hair bound in red cloth, her arm raised to show strength earned through labour, her expression confident with the knowledge of what she has accomplished and what that accomplishment means. She is not asking permission. She is declaring capacity. She is not temporary. She is permanent. She is every woman who ever discovered that what she was told she could not do was merely what she had never been allowed to attempt. She is proof that history moves not only through the decisions of generals and politicians, but through the accumulated choices of millions of ordinary people who, when necessity demands and opportunity permits, reveal themselves to be extraordinary.